As Italy entered the war in June of 1941, its first target became the British-held island of Malta. This tiny rock in the Mediterranean was the most bombed country of World War II. But the Maltese were not going to give in, nor were the British. Tony Spooner was an RAF pilot on Malta. This is where he met the enemy, on the battlefront. As 1940 begins, Italy's fascist leader Benito Mussolini is incensed because the British control the nearby island of Malta. This outpost is over 1,000 miles from the nearest British bases at Gibraltar in the west and Alexandria in the east, but it is only 50 miles from Sicily. Malta gives England control of the Mediterranean, and in 1940, the British are at war with Italy's ally, the Germans. On June 11th, one day after Italy enters the war, Mussolini unleashes his bombers on Malta. One RAF pilot who is stationed in Malta is Tony Spooner.
I was there for, I think it was about 1,250 air raids. Not everyone was a serious air raid. Many of them were just reconnaissance flights. But we were bombed on average about 3 or 4 times every day. The Italians used rather antiquated aircraft, and they weren't particularly well protected by armor, and they tended to turn tail at the first sign of any opposition. I was in Coastal Command, and our job in Malta was to go out at night and find the ships which were trying to transport supplies from Italy and Sicily to Rommel's forces in North Africa. And having found them, our job then was to home other people to come and attack them, and occasionally attack them ourselves. Oh, the population took it very well, bearing in mind it wasn't even their war. As far as possible, the routine went on. It was business as usual to the extent that you could do business as usual. The bars kept open as long as they possibly could, but of course we eventually ran out of beer and everything else nearly. But it was pretty grim food. It was all tin food or whatever they could find.
While the Maltese go about their daily business, they learn to live with the constant air raids from the ineffective and ill-equipped Italian Air Force.
You get used to it like everything else. It's pretty frightening at first, but then you see other people are paying no attention to it, and in the end you start paying no attention to it.
The Maltese show no signs of giving in, and British anti-aircraft fire wears down Mussolini's pilots.
The Italian aerial bombardment of Malta is a failure, partly because the planes themselves have small bomb loads, and partly because the Italian bombs aren't very good. Partly, the Italian bombers have trouble hitting their target in the face of an anti-aircraft defense, which, while in its initial stages not all that formidable, is still more flock than the Italians have ever faced before.
British submarines and seaplanes emerge around Malta and constantly torpedo Axis supply vessels on their way to North Africa. This activity is becoming a thorn in the side of the Germans and an embarrassment to the Italians. In January 1941, Hitler sends an entire German air fleet, which has been called back from the Russian front and moved to Sicily. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring is given control of 2,000 top-rate aircraft. Kesselring's mission is to gain control of the air and sea between South Italy and North Africa.
Each adversary had a slightly different reason for wanting this particular piece of rock. As the attacks go on, Malta becomes a symbol for both sides. It's been called the Mediterranean Verdun. The struggle for Malta took on an importance that had nothing to do with the actual utility of the island. In many ways, the German air forces that go after Malta are at the peak of their effectiveness. They've been operating in Europe and in the Mediterranean since the beginning of the war. The crews are well trained, very experienced, and jumping high morale. And this is particularly true of the bomber wings, who have had it mostly their own way since coming to the Mediterranean. They faced very little effective fighter opposition from the British. And so they are confident in their ability to soften up Malta, not least because they see this as a good way of showing up the Italians. There's a swagger in the Luftwaffe's approach here. Again, the crews aren't specially trained, but they've received ordinary Luftwaffe training, by and large, which is very, very good.
Until the Germans came along, we went the smallest bit frightened of the Italians. But the Germans had dive bombers, and they were far more determined. And it was a different story altogether. And they achieved complete air superiority over the island at one time. To their credit, they really bombed targets, although, of course, when chased by fighters, they often jettisoned their bombs on other places. And so the bombing was concentrated upon 4 areas. One was the port area and the 3 airfields. So everything adjacent to the port, which was a highly populated area, was flattened, and everything on and around the airfield were flattened.
By December, you've got over 1,000 air raids mounted by aircraft which are fast enough and maneuverable enough to elude ground defenses and shake up ground fire. The German Dornier, Heinkel, and Junkers 88, they call them medium bombers, we call them light medium bombers, are fast, maneuverable, take punishment well. And so it becomes harder and harder to bring them down. And a Malta anti-aircraft defense that depends heavily on local volunteers is beginning to wonder, well, what's it take to get these guys?